You'll go from being, say, 160 at 25 to being 190 at 55. So you'll go from being of healthy weight to being obese, and it's all 20 calories a day. That's all that'll do it. And the reason this is important, and this is what this fellow Eugene Dubois said in his textbook Basal Metabolism and Health and Disease back in 1936. Dubois was the leading, American expert on metabolism. And Dubois said, considering this calculation, there's no stranger phenomenon than the maintenance of a constant body weight under marked variation in bodily activity and food consumption. None of us can judge our calorie intake to even close to 20 calories a day. And in general, we're all clueless about what our expenditure is. So how is it possible that we could keep this kind of accuracy if this is what's necessary to practice energy balance? And you could always say, well, okay, maybe this isn't possible. What we can do is look in the mirror, or we have various ways of knowing that we're getting fatter. So as we get fatter, we go from being in energy surplus to being in an energy deficit, and we could rein back, and that's how we could do it. So even if we can't do it every day, we could balance it over a decade. But then you have to ask the question, how do animals do it? Because animals don't look in the mirror. Animals don't, they don't know if their belts are getting too tight. So, and assuming we work the same way as most animals, how do they maintain energy? How do they maintain leanness or maintain their weights? Is what they have to do it is to practice to match their energy into their energy out consciously. Let's go to the next slide. This is the genetics of obesity. And by the way, I could see as usual looking at the time that my talk is going to take more than an hour, for which I apologize. I could speed up. And if some people want me to do it, just chime in and say, for Christ's sake, I'll speed it up. Genetics of obesity. And now what I'm doing is channeling the obesity researchers in Europe prior to the Second World War. These were metabolism geneticists, endocrinologists who had an entirely different way of looking at obesity. And one of the things they pointed out is that we know that there's a strong genetic component to obesity. If your parents are overweight, far more likely that you will than if your parents are lean. And one way to look at it, here's a lean pair of identical twins on the left. This is from a 1933 German textbook. No, actually, this is from a 1940 American textbook that was based on the German textbook. A lean pair of identical twins on the left and an obese pair of identical twins on the right. And our energy balance hypothesis says the pair on the right is fatter because they expend more energy, because they take in more energy and they expend less than the pair on the left. So our energy balance hypothesis can conceivably explain the right to left comparison. But what about the fact that the twins on the left have the identical bodies and identical fat accumulation, and the twins on the right have the identical bodies and identical fat accumulation? And are we supposed to believe that the genes that determine obesity determine precisely how many calories these women ate every day and precisely how many they expended? Or do they determine something else about these women? For instance, just as they might have determined how tall they grew, they might have determined their fat accumulation as well. Let's go to the next slide. This is a variation on this theme. It's animal husbandry. And, animal breeders for centuries, if not millennia, have been breeding animals to be more or less fatty. Recently we've been breeding beef cattle to be less fatty because the U.S. government tells us we should eat less fat. And if you look at the cow on the right, the Aberdeen Angus, it's a bull, and it's a beef cattle, and you can see it produces particularly fatty meats. It's a stocky animal, and you can see in the meat below the intramuscular and then the fatty meat it produces. And the cow on the right is a Jersey cow, and that's a dairy cow, and you can see the swollen udders, and you can see how lean it is in comparison. All the question you have to ask is, what are we breeding for when we breed for a fatter cow or a cow with more fat content in its meat like the Aberdeen Angus? Are we breeding for a cow that eats more, that grazes more, more efficiently takes in calories from its diet, from the grass with each bite? Are we breeding for a cow that spends an extra hour a day out on the pasture? With the Jersey cow on the right, are we breeding for a cow that, like the old Far Side cartoon, when it gets dark out, maybe they all go for jogs, they stop, standing around, they go for a long run? And that's obviously absurd. And what we're likely to be breeding for is perhaps some, quality of the meat itself. Or you can also think of it in terms of breeding for how the fuel they take in is partitioned. And in the meat, you could think of the Aberdeen Angus as a machine. This is very cold-hearted, but I'll do it for a second. As a machine that takes in calories on one end and converts it into protein and fat. And the dairy cow takes in calories and converts it into milk. And with the Aberdeen Angus, you don't want to waste. You don't want a cow, like we don't have a lot of beef cattle that go for jogs or are very energetic, because you don't want it wasting energy going for runs. And that's one reason why cattle ranchers will pen in their animals, or because they don't want them wasting energy on getting exercise, harsh as that seems. With the Jersey cow, you want a cow that takes in calories and converts it all to milk. So you don't even want it wasting a lot of calories by stocking its body tissue with fat. So you could think that the genes that control fat accumulation, at least in these animals, control how they partition the fuel they do take in. Let's go to the next slide. This is slide 28, sexual variations. This is another observation made by these pre-World War II researchers. You could see, men and women fatten differently. And by the way, I apologize if anyone finds these slides offensive. In modern textbooks, you will find no slides of naked men and women. You'll find occasionally obese rats. The pre-World War II researchers thought that they were important learning guides, because one of the things you want to know is not just how much people put on fat, how much fat they put on, but where they put it on. So if you look at the man on the left, men put on fat above the waist, abdominal obesity, apple-shaped. It's the obesity that's associated with heart disease. Women tend to put on fat below the waist. And one of the questions you ask is, obviously that's controlled by genetics. It's interesting, if a man puts on the fat below the waist, it will not increase his risk of heart disease. So you could ask, you have two men, one gets fat above the waist, one gets fat below the waist, one increases heart disease risk, one doesn't. What does how much energy they took in or expended have to do with it? Because they both had to take in energy, more energy than they expended to get fat. When men go through puberty, they lose fat and gain muscle. It's interesting, men and women, boys and girls, have roughly the same percentage of fat on their bodies prior to puberty. And then men go through puberty, they get bigger, they get heavier, they put on muscle, they lose fat. And women go through puberty and they put on fat in breasts and hips. And they come out with 50% more fat tissue on their bodies than men did. And again, both men and women will have had to overeat to accommodate their growing bodies, and yet one group puts on muscle and one group puts on fat, and puts on fat in specific places. So you're asking yourself, what do the calories have to do with it? What does the overeating have to do with it? The overeating's a given. So here's where it gets even trickier. This is slide 29 is a rare disorder. By the 1950s, there are about 200 of these on record. It's progressive lipid dystrophy. And in this case, the woman on the left, what happens, the reason it's progressive is because the fat loss, these cases, and they're mostly women, they start losing fat in their face, and they lose all the subcutaneous fat, and that fat loss goes down in their body. And one British physician in the 1920s suggested that in one patient of his, he measured it went down at the rate of an inch a year. And then it tends to stop usually right around their navel, right about their waist, above their hip bones. And then in some of these patients, they get obese below the waist. It gets what's called lower body obesity. So what this kind of situation does is it splits up. It gives us a sort of Gedanken experiment, a learning experiment for obesity, because you can go to the next slide, slide 30, and you could say to yourself, as these pre-World War II Europeans did, are we going to blame the top half, the emaciated half, on undereating, as we're used to doing, and the bottom half, the obese half, on overeating? And that's obviously absurd. But if this woman had, say, 5 to 10 pounds more fat on her upper body, she would go into the doctor. She would never be diagnosed as having progressive lipid dystrophy. She would just be diagnosed as being obese, and she would be told that overeating was the cause and she should eat less and exercise. And as these Europeans said, if we can't blame this localized obesity, like the lower body obesity and progressive lipodystrophy on overeating, why do we think we can blame general obesity when it tends to cover the whole body?